The world of showbiz has been left stunned by the sudden death of screen legend Sam Neill, just weeks after revealing he was cancer-free.
2 months before he died, Sam Neill stood in front of a camera and said the words every cancer patient dreams of saying out loud to someone listening. No cancer left in his body, not a trace of it anywhere. He sounded thrilled. He even talked about doing one more film. Then, on July 13th, 2026, without warning, he was gone at 78. His family called it sudden and unexpected, two words that make almost no sense next to a scan that cleaned just weeks earlier. Nicole Kidman, who had known him since she was 18 years old, said something this week that explains exactly why his death hit Hollywood as hard as it did. And it has almost nothing to do with dinosaurs. A scan that came back clean. In April of 2026, only a few months before his death, Sam Neill sat in front of an Australian news camera and delivered the kind of update most cancer patients never actually get to give in their lifetime. He had just received a scan, and it showed no cancer anywhere in his body. Results that came back clean enough to surprise even the doctors who had been managing his case for years by that point. He called it an extraordinary thing, and he meant it, describing the feeling with a kind of disbelief that came through even on camera, the tone of a man who had genuinely stopped expecting good news somewhere along the way. For years before that moment, he had been fighting a rare and aggressive blood cancer called angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, a diagnosis he first revealed publicly in his own memoir in early 2023. Chemotherapy had stopped working at one point, leaving him, in his own words, at a loss, in a situation that did not look good at all, the kind of stretch where doctors start preparing a patient for the worst rather than the best. He qualified for a clinical trial using a treatment called CAR T-cell therapy, a relatively new approach that reprograms a patient's own immune cells to hunt down cancer more precisely than traditional chemotherapy ever could. And it worked well enough that by the spring of 2026, he was celebrating remission on camera and openly discussing another movie role he was excited to take on, sounding, by every account, like a man who genuinely believed he had years left ahead of him. He had also said on more than one occasion in earlier interviews that he was not remotely afraid of dying, a line that read very differently once people heard it again this week. 2 months after that hopeful scan, none of that mattered anymore, and the news that followed landed with a kind of whiplash nobody who watched that interview could have prepared for. The hospital in Sydney. On July 13th, 2026, Sam Neill died in Sydney, Australia, at St. Vincent's Private Hospital, surrounded by the family he had spent decades prioritizing over the demands of a global film career. His family's statement used a word that stopped people cold: sudden. Not a relapse, not a long decline. Sudden and unexpected, the family wrote, adding that Sam remained cancer-free at the time of his death, a detail that only made the timing feel crueler to everyone who had just watched him celebrate remission 2 months earlier. No official cause was released to the public, and the family did not offer further explanation beyond saying he passed with the same dignity that had defined his whole life, surrounded by the people who loved him most in the world. They also thanked the hospital staff by name for the care he received in his final hours, a small detail that said something about how the family wanted his story to end, with gratitude rather than anger or public speculation about what exactly had gone wrong so quickly after such encouraging news. He was 78 years old, and just 2 months earlier, he had been telling reporters he felt like he had his whole future back, even mentioning excitement about work still ahead of him, plans that would now never happen. Within hours of the announcement, tributes started arriving from people who do not usually comment publicly on anything, world leaders among them, flooding social media faster than most celebrity deaths typically generate, a pace that surprised even entertainment journalists used to covering this kind of story on a regular basis. But the reaction that actually explains why this loss cut so deep, more than any prime minister's statement could, came from a woman who had known Sam Neill since long before most of the world knew his name at all. 18 years old, on a boat. In 1989, A barely known 18-year-old actress named Nicole Kidman was cast opposite Sam Neill in a tense psychological thriller called Dead Calm, playing a young wife trapped on a boat with her husband and a dangerous stranger who boards their vessel in the middle of the open ocean. It was one of Kidman's earliest major roles, the kind of part that either launches a career or quietly ends one before it really begins. And the pressure on a teenager carrying that much of a film was enormous. Neill, already an established actor by that point, with a decade of work behind him across New Zealand and Australia, including well-regarded roles in art house dramas most American audiences had never seen, did something that mattered more to her than any single scene in the finished film. He took her under his wing, not as a mentor giving notes from a distance between takes, but as someone who treated a teenager on her first major set like she genuinely belonged there, worth protecting rather than simply tolerating. That relationship did not fade once the cameras stopped rolling and the film made its money, and both of their careers moved on to bigger things, hers eventually taking her all the way to an Academy Award of her own, decades later. Decades later, in 2019, the two of them ended up on the same stage again for a Big Little Lies panel, alongside Laura Dern, three actors whose careers had crossed paths so many times by then that reporters barely mentioned it was unusual, treating the reunion almost like old friends catching up, rather than a rare industry event worth commenting on at length. What Kidman said this week about that first year on Dead Calm reveals exactly how rare that kind of friendship actually is in an industry built on people drifting apart the moment a project wraps and the next job begins. What Nicole actually said? This week, in the hours after the news broke, Nicole Kidman described herself as immensely saddened by what had happened, and what she said next is the part actually worth sitting with rather than scrolling past. She said Sam was one of the greats, a joy to be around, and that meeting him at 18 years old changed the entire trajectory of how she experienced the industry. Because he took her under his wing, and the two of them stayed friends for life afterward, not just colleagues who happened to make one film together decades earlier and never spoke again. She described him as charming, kind, funny, and intelligent throughout the entirety of their long friendship, then said he would be greatly missed, extending her sympathy directly to his family in the same brief statement. It is a short statement, only a few sentences long, but it carries the weight of 37 years of friendship behind every word. The kind of loyalty that does not require a person to still be working together constantly to remain real and specific. The kind that survives entire decades of separate careers without ever needing regular contact to stay genuine. Kidman was far from the only one who felt that way about him. Other co-stars used almost identical language, kindness, warmth, generosity, repeated so often across dozens of separate tributes from people who had never met each other, that it started to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Nobody had bothered to point out publicly while he was still alive to hear it directly. But to understand why an entire industry reacted the way it did, all at once, you have to go back to who Sam Neill actually was before any of them ever met him, long before Hollywood knew his name at all. Nigel from OMAG. Despite everything the name Sam Neill eventually came to represent in Hollywood, Sam Neill was not born Sam Neill at all. He entered the world as Nigel John Dermot Neill in Omagh, Northern Ireland, in 1947, and moved with his family to New Zealand at age 7 when his father, also a New Zealander by birth, left the army and brought the family home to the South Island. At 11 years old, surrounded by other boys, also named Nigel, at his school, he switched to Sam instead. A name he later said just sounded friendlier and a little more like a Labrador than his given name ever did. A small joke he repeated often in later interviews about his own childhood. He described himself, in his own words years later, as a wonky, nerdy, stuttering kid who was not particularly good at sports, someone who did not exactly stand out for the reasons children usually want to stand out at that age. His first taste of performing came in school plays. including a small role as a bridesmaid in a production of The Pirates of Penzance, a detail he clearly found funny enough to keep bringing up decades into a serious film career. He got his real break in 1977 with a low-budget New Zealand film called Sleeping Dogs, the first feature made in the country in over a decade at that point, shot on a shoestring budget by filmmakers determined to prove a national film industry could exist at all. And it opened the door to bigger roles across Australia soon afterward, launching a career that eventually spanned 5 decades and dozens of films across nearly every genre imaginable. One of the most coveted roles in the entire industry, at a time when landing it would have changed the entire shape of his career overnight. And by his own account, his heart simply was not in it during the day-long audition, describing the whole experience afterward as awkward rather than thrilling, since he did not want to become the Bond that nobody actually liked, a fear he later called worse than simply losing the role outright. Underneath the charm that so many co-stars mentioned this week was a man who had spent years quietly fighting something far more serious than a role he did not get, something almost none of his fans knew the full details of until he chose to share them himself. By the time that fight became public, Neill had already built one of the more unusual careers in modern film. A submarine officer in The Hunt for Red October, a grieving husband opposite Holly Hunter in the Oscar-winning film The Piano, a menacing gang leader in the television series Peaky Blinders, and a curmudgeonly uncle in the beloved New Zealand comedy Hunt for the Wilder People, a role that many of his own countrymen considered his most personally cherished performance of all. He was knighted in New Zealand in 2022 for his contribution to film, and received a Screen Legend Award in 2025, accepting it with the same self-deprecating humor that defined nearly every interview he ever gave, joking that sticking around long enough was basically the entire qualification required. A fight he mostly kept private. Behind nearly every warm tribute posted this week was a fight almost none of the public had followed closely in real time. Sam Neill first revealed his cancer diagnosis publicly in his 2023 memoir, titled Did I Ever Tell You This?, a book largely built around his own reflections on a career spent mostly outside the biggest Hollywood spotlight, describing a stage 3 case of angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma that had already put him through a difficult stretch of treatment by the time the book came out that same year. He spoke to reporters that same year about how the previous months had included real dark moments, treatment that eventually stopped working entirely, and a period where he genuinely did not know if he would come out the other side of it. A level of honesty that surprised people used to celebrities keeping serious illness carefully hidden from public view. Rather than disappear from public life to deal with it privately, the way many actors in his position might have chosen to, he kept working, kept talking to journalists about it directly, and kept returning to causes that mattered to him personally, including an environmental documentary he released in early 2026, opposing a large industrial gold mine proposed for the region of New Zealand, where he had spent decades running his own small winery. He also kept his sense of humor fully intact the entire time, famously naming farm animals after Hollywood friends and joking about the ones that met unfortunate ends at the hands of local wildlife. Small stories that made their way into nearly every profile written about him in his final years. A close friend, the Australian comedian Magda Szubanski, after whom he had once named one of his ducks on the farm, said afterward that she had spoken with him not long before his death, and he had sounded cancer-free, genuinely happy, and excited about what was still ahead of him, a detail that lines up exactly with the hopeful April interview and makes the sudden ending feel even harder to reconcile. That same steady, humor-filled resilience is exactly what made the sudden nature of his death land so differently than a slow, expected decline would have, catching an entire industry off guard in a way a longer illness simply would not have. The tributes that flooded in. Within a day of the announcement, Tributes arrived from almost every corner of the industry Sam Neill had touched across 5 decades of work. A scale of response usually reserved for actors far more consistently famous in a single era than someone whose career had genuinely peaked in several completely different decades across multiple continents. Steven Spielberg, who directed him as paleontologist Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, called him exceptionally collaborative and noted how strange it had been directing someone so warm and fatherly in real life to play a character annoyed by children on screen, a contrast Spielberg clearly found amusing even in his grief. Laura Dern spoke of a lifetime friendship built on loyalty and protectiveness, describing him as someone who showed her real depths of care, wrapped in his trademark dry wit. Cillian Murphy, his Peaky Blinders co-star, described him as one of the kindest and gentlest people he had ever worked with, admiring and adoring him in equal measure by his own account. Carl Urban called him a trailblazer for an entire generation of New Zealand actors who followed him into the industry, crediting him with helping build a national film industry that barely existed when Neill first started out in the 1970s. Toni Collette, who worked alongside him on 2 separate films years apart, wrote that he was the most beautiful, decent gentleman she had ever known. A hero, a legend, someone she already missed more than words could easily capture in a single post. Alec Baldwin, who worked with him decades earlier on The Hunt for Red October, wrote that he had always hoped to work with him again someday, a wish shared by several other directors who reached out this week, including Colin Trevorrow, who called him a deeply soulful man and said it is not every lifetime a person gets to befriend someone people would later describe as a legend. Rachel Griffiths, who directed him in her own directorial debut years later and worked with him again as recently as 2023, said she planned to open a bottle from his own winery that same night, simply to mark the loss properly. Kylie Minogue simply posted a short farewell in the local dialect both New Zealanders and Australians commonly use for exactly this kind of loss. Even actors who had only shared a single film with him decades earlier, people who might easily have let the memory fade into a footnote, took time to post something personal rather than a generic statement handed to them by a publicist. Even New Zealand's Prime Minister and Australia's Prime Minister issued public statements, an unusual honor for an actor whose earliest work came from a film industry that barely registered internationally when he started out, let alone one that typically earns political tributes on his passing. Almost none of those tributes led with Jurassic Park, despite it being the role that made him a household name to millions of people who never saw any of his other work across 5 decades of film and television. They led with kindness, with humor, with decades of quiet loyalty, the exact same qualities Nicole Kidman had been describing about an 18-year-old actress and the older co-star who chose to take care of her on a small boat on a film set nearly 4 decades before the rest of the world felt the full weight of losing him all at once. A loss that somehow managed to feel personal to people who had never even met him. If someone took you under their wing the way Sam Neill did for an 18-year-old Nicole Kidman, would you even recognize how much it mattered until decades later, the way she clearly does now? If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales. And hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.